Come now to Genesis chapter 26, which is the only chapter in the whole of the Bible that focuses specifically and only on the character of Isaac. And before we really read the scripture or get into it very much, I want to read to you a paragraph from the Word Biblical Commentary, which I think sums up this chapter and Isaac's role very nicely. It says, Isaac spends most of his life in the shadow of other members of his family, either of his father Abraham or of his sons Jacob and Esau. Indeed, after chapter 27, he virtually disappears from the story until the brief mention of his death in chapter 35, verses 27 and 28. Here and only here within Genesis does he appear as a person in his own right. But even here, he seems to have less drive than either his father or his sons. This narrative tells the story of his relations with the Philistines, portrays him as a rather timid character whom the Gerarites push around. Nevertheless, this somewhat ineffectual man receives yet greater promises and experiences their fulfillment in fuller measure than even his father Abraham did. This narrative thus demonstrates that the power of God can work even through those who by human standards are most unlikely material. As we begin to look at this passage of Scripture together, we'll read a few verses and then we'll talk about it in a moment. But I do want to say that what we see happening in this chapter is very, very familiar to our eyes because we saw Abraham go through this same sort of deal with perhaps even the same characters. We'll talk about whether they're the same characters or not. But Abimelech and some of his men. Around one of the wells mentioned is even the same well, the well of Beersheba, or the well of the oath. The word Sheba can mean oath or seven, so the well of seven or the well of the oath. But this is a very familiar story to our eyes. And really what I think is probably going on here is the carrying forth of the promise. Remember, the underlying theme that's going on in throughout from Abraham on throughout the rest of the book of Genesis is the carrying forth of the covenant and the blessing that God has promised to Abraham, now on to Isaac, and then on to Jacob, and then on forward from there. So what we're seeing here with Isaac is a telling of a story that happened with Abraham, where we can kind of notice Isaac turning into a man who not only receives the same blessing, but even plays some of the same games and goes through the same drama that Abraham has gone through to see that God really is going to be faithful. It's sort of letting the reader know that whatever you were thinking about Abraham, it's all passing on to Isaac. I think that's more or less what's going on in this passage. Now, some scholars who doubt Mosaic authorship will look at this and say, well, it looks like this is a story that, whether it happened or not, is supposed to have happened to Abraham. Some other tradition perhaps thought it happened to Isaac. And so you have this mixing of traditions together because different groups of authors wrote the different portions of Genesis, and then an editor came along and fitted them all together. And it was a mistake to include this, and because what we have is really the same story in one place ascribed to Isaac and in one place ascribed to Abraham. In fact, we probably mentioned when we were discussing Abraham's dual encounter with Abimelech in the same way, where pretty much the same thing happens twice, at least the major thrust of the story. The same sorts of scholars felt like that represented two separate traditions. But it's interesting to know that over the past few decades, there's been a changing of the tide, even among some of the scholars who are in those camps, who look at it that way. Many scholars over the past few decades have decided that this story presupposes that the reader is aware of Abraham's dealing with Abimelech. And they're willing to grant that probably what is going on in this passage is what I described a moment ago, where you have a story that demonstrates that Isaac is fulfilling the same drama that Abraham had fulfilled previously, that everything that happened with Abraham is now passing on to Isaac. So even some of the scholars that some of the conservative folks would consider a bit more liberal are coming around to the fact that at least this story does seem to presuppose the other story. One reason for that is it seems to reference the other story, and then on top of that, it doesn't go into a certain level of detail that you would expect it would if this story was to be taken alone. It doesn't go into that level of detail because the reader should already have some of the pertinent details from the previous story. The greater difficulty is in trying to figure out where in the timeline it takes place. Now, I can imagine that probably makes some of you feel a bit uncomfortable when I talk about the fact that some of these things are not told chronologically. I don't know why that should. If that bothers you, see our previous lecture and you'll hear why we know that that is the case just based off of chapter 25 alone. And we know that that is the case based off of chapters 11 and 12. And there are other examples. In this passage, the chronology is in question because we don't hear anything here about Jacob and Esau. That's one thing that must be mentioned. Moreover, some people think that Rebekah would not have been considered, this is really silly to me, that Rebekah would not have been considered beautiful to Abimelech if she had had children. That to me seems patently absurd. Why would a woman who's had children not still be considered possibly beautiful? That's really ridiculous and probably offensive to the women listeners. But what we can say is they're never mentioned, number one, and Isaac is able to successfully pass her off as though she's not his wife. And that is made more likely if there aren't children present, especially given that he, as we'll see in the story, will have lived in a land where people connected to Abimelech would have seemed to have known this if they'd lived there for very long. Also, you could add a little bit of questionable evidence toward this end by the fact that Isaac and Rebekah, what gives them away is that they're seen kind of flirtatiously fooling around. Not that people much older or who have had kids don't do that, but it kind of speaks to maybe a younger point in your marriage. Maybe not. Maybe that's not thinking very romantically of older folks or people who have had kids. I'm just telling you what the scholars point out as pieces of evidence toward the questionable chronology. But the best piece of evidence is just, I think, that they're not mentioned and that this interrupts the flow of the story of Jacob and Esau, which began in chapter 25 and will continue in chapter 27. So, the other pieces of data, the bottom line is some of these pieces of evidence are floated to see if they'll make it because scholars have to write PhD dissertations and they have to write journal articles and they have to look for something that maybe no one's ever thought of before, and so they come up with things like this. So who knows? But I do think there are a couple of good reasons to think that this might not be told in chronological order. On the other hand, you would think that if this was earlier, well then couldn't Isaac just bring Abraham up to kind of speak to the fact that there was already a promise that was made to the offspring, that was supposed to extend to the offspring, of a peaceful treaty between these two people. But that doesn't seem to work because we see in verse 18 of this chapter that it says, Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. So you have specific mention of Abraham's death. So I think the best way to take this is probably just to assume that this does happen exactly chronologically and that this takes place somewhere after Jacob and Esau have been born and even after Abraham has died. Why it is that Jacob and Esau are not more specifically mentioned in the story may well be just because Moses felt that there needed to be at least one chapter that was specifically dedicated to Isaac's dealings with Abimelech, and why Abimelech didn't notice and his people didn't notice that Jacob and Esau were not around, which would have given away that Isaac and Rebekah were married. I don't know. It's tough, but that's what we're given here. And perhaps some of what I've said to you already doesn't make a whole lot of sense since we haven't read through the passage. I may have made an unfair assumption that you would have perhaps been familiar with or looked over this passage before we began. So with that, let's go ahead and begin reading in chapter 26, and we will make some comments as we go. Now there was a famine in the land, and besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So now you'll see what I mean here, that this doesn't seem to have been written by a separate author, or doesn't necessitate an other author who is unaware of the previous story of the famine in Abraham's day, because if there was, there would have been, he wouldn't have referenced the previous famine, right? So this seems to have been written with full awareness of the previous story, and that the readers would have known about the previous story. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you, for to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and I will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, and my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac lived in Gerar. Okay, we'll pick up in verse 7 in just a few moments. A couple of things to say about this. First of all, this is now God officially stating this promise with Isaac as well, and uses some of the same terminology. The land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you, for to you and your descendants, and so on and so forth. The land which I will tell you. This is a recurring theme. And he talks about how numerous Isaac's offspring will be, and that this is all connected back to the story of Abraham. In fact, at this point, we could say it may well be that the reason that this story interrupts the story of Jacob is to connect the Abrahamic blessing on to Jacob. Now, we've started talking about Jacob and Esau. Now, to interrupt that, let's talk a little bit about the blessing that is in question here that God promised to Abraham, and that now he's passing on to Isaac and Isaac's descendants. And oh, by the way, we just started talking about them, and we're going to talk about them some more in the next chapter. So in case the readers are having trouble following, we're making a connection, a link, and Isaac kind of serves as the human link between Abraham and Jacob to that end. So we see Isaac here seemingly appreciative of this. And then in verse 7 it says, "When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, 'She is my sister.' For he was afraid to say, 'my wife,' thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. It came about, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, 'Behold, certainly she is your wife. How then did you say, she is my sister?' And Isaac said to him, 'Because I said I might die on account of her.' Abimelech said, 'What is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us.' So Abimelech charged all the people, saying, 'He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death.'" Okay, so a few things to say in this section. First of all, this is interesting that we have this seemingly the same character of Abimelech. And later on, we will see another similar character that we're also familiar with, named Phicol. And so it looks as though these are the same exact figures that Abraham had dealt with. Well, that may well be. Another possibility is that you could say, well, Abimelech is a title. I think I went over this when we discussed Abimelech before. You could say Abimelech is a title, just like Pharaoh was a title. It kind of means king. It's like king in this particular land. He's the Abimelech. That's a possibility. If that's the case, though, then that means that Phicol is also a title, unless you got two Abimelechs, but only one Phicol, and it's the same man. It could be that Abimelech and Phicol are also titles, and maybe even Ahuzath, who we're going to look at in a little while. So it's hard to say. It could be the same man. It could be, but it doesn't have to be the same man. It could well be a title. In fact, a lot of scholars think that it probably is a title. So if you look at it through those lenses, then we do see the same story, but it's not exactly the same because we have different characters showing up. Also, you see here that it says that Isaac has lived in the land for a long time, it says in verse 8. And Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw that Isaac and Rebekah were kind of being romantic. He was caressing her, I guess in a manner that is obvious that this is not your sister. This is clearly your, at least a romance, likely your wife. And that was the deduction there. Now, if that's the case, how are we to understand it? Is Abimelech peeping Tom here, going in and looking all the windows? Is that what's happening? Probably not. Some people think that the fact that it says he saw this through a window, it could be that Isaac had a privileged spot, and Abimelech is looking out his palace window and seeing either across the street or across an alley or something, or even just across a courtyard. They may have lived in the same complex, and he's looking across and seeing Isaac in there with Rebekah, and he may not have intended to see this. I live in downtown Evansville, Indiana, and I've never seen anything like that, thank goodness. But the house that we live in is literally, I can go out into the breezeway between my house and the house next to us, and I can put one hand on my house and one hand on the next house. And the houses have almost the same layout, and so our windows are in all the same places, and the windows are parallel to each other on across the breezeway. And there have been many times when I've been in my kitchen washing dishes or something and looked up and seen across through into the other house, not intentionally, just you see some movement, and your natural inclination is to look up, and you see the other couple in there watching TV or something in their living room, because my kitchen is across from their living room. It's it makes you feel a bit creepy, and it makes you want to get some good blinds and curtains, but it happens even when you have the purest of intentions living next to someone in a city like this, and you're close to someone else's house. That well may be what could have happened. But you'll see here why, after it says they've lived there for a long time and doesn't mention Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and Esau's presence never gave it away, why some people think, well, Jacob and Esau hadn't come along yet. And then, of course, if you go along with the piece of data that Isaac and Rebekah being kind of lovebirds kind of indicates this is earlier on in their relationship, who knows? But there you have it. This is how it comes out. He looks across through a window and sees this. And then he says, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Now, scholars suspect that this guilt refers to a great sin that this kind of speaks to what was considered a great sin of sleeping with someone who's not your wife. Later on, mentioned in Leviticus, that would have necessitated one of the more serious offerings, the guilt offering. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 21, well, let's look at verse 20. It says, "Now if a man lies carnally with a woman who is a slave acquired for another man, but who has in no way been redeemed nor given her freedom, there shall be punishment. They shall not, however, be put to death because she was not free. He shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord to the doorway of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering." So this is a very serious offering, and this mention of guilt seems to be the same sort of phrasing that's used later by Moses in the book of Leviticus. And so this speaks to a very serious sin, and Abimelech is aware of what a serious sin it would have been, and so he's a little bit freaked out by this. He thinks he might surely be put to death even over this. Verse 12, "Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him." If I'm not mistaken, this is the place, this may be the first place where we see any mention of anyone in Abraham's family sowing and reaping in the land, which shows that God is blessing them in a lot of ways, and blessing them in such a way that they didn't need to go anywhere else for a famine. That was not a necessity. Verse 13, "And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. For he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Now all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are too powerful for us." And Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So now, remember, when you think about, and we've mentioned this a couple of times throughout this study, that when you think about Abraham and now Isaac, you're seeing an increasingly populous and wealthy sort of character. He would have looked like a king to everybody around them. And especially now that we see that he's got crops and everything else, he would have been becoming more well-known and more wealthy, because if there's a famine or anything else, people have to go to him. I mean, he's got the wells, he's got the crops. If we want to survive, we got to trade with him. We've got to always be going to him, asking for support and trying to trade whatever we've got to get things from him. And so it's understandable why they become envious and might start dealing harshly, like getting into disputes over wells and things like that, and why they might think that he's becoming too powerful, as Abimelech says here, because if he wanted to, he could maybe attack and kill us all. You know, this is the concern that's happening. And so it says in verse 18, "Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, 'The water is ours.' So he named the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too. So he named it Sitnah. He moved away from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth. For he said, 'At last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land.' Then he went up from there to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, 'I am the God of your father. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham.' So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well." It's an interesting thing here that God wants to make clear to Isaac. He's got no reason to be afraid. He says, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear. I am with you." So number one, Isaac can be certain that God is going with him in all of this. And second, he's been told not to be afraid. Now, Esek means quarrel, because they were quarreling over that well. Sitnah means hostility, and Rehoboth means open spaces. So he's naming these things. These are not the happiest names. You know, these are sad names, because he's in a bad spot here. Then in verse 26, "Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor Ahuzath and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, 'Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?'" Now, Isaac's getting a little sassy here, and it may indicate that he's gotten a little bit of courage. That may be what's going on. He's manning up, because he's just had God communicate directly to him, telling him, "Look, don't be afraid. I'm going to stand with you in all this. You're going to be fine. I've done this for your father, and I'm going to bless and multiply your descendants." I just told you that several verses back. Start trusting me here. Start believing me. And so now it looks like he's getting a little mouthy. He says, to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" They said, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you." Now this should have been completely unnecessary, because this oath was already made with Abraham, and it was supposed to affect the descendants as well. They're the ones who are backing up off of things here. But another covenant is going to be made. Now, they say Yahweh is with you. The word they use is Yahweh is with you. So do they believe in Yahweh? Well, if I haven't covered this already in the passage or in this study, I should mention it now, that the mention of another people's God, the way these people thought was all these gods are real. Abimelech would have thought this way, that all these gods are real. Yahweh is real. Molech is real. All these other gods are real. The idea is that it's not my God. My God's the best God. And they've got their God. I've got my God. Everybody's got a God. There are cultures that are somewhat this way even to this day. Among Hindus, there are what are called bhakti cults. And these bhakti cults are little groups that, they believe in a multiplicity of gods, but these different groups have one of the gods that's their favorite God that they worship all the time. And there's even a Christian bhakti cult. There's even a bhakti cult. This is why missionaries that try to witness to Hindus have to be really careful with their wording, because if they say, well, don't you know that Jesus is the Savior, that Jesus is the one true God? Don't you want to have that God? Don't you want to know about that God? Don't you want to be saved and worship the one true God? And they well could say, yes, of course, absolutely. We'll be Christians now. You're right. And they'll looking as though they've just gotten saved and repented of their sins and trusted Jesus as their Savior, and He's going to be their one and only God from henceforth. But what they will do is they'll start worshiping Jesus. But it's not as though they don't believe the other gods are real gods, or that Jesus is the only God, or really, if you want to get down to it, whether He's even necessarily the best God. It's just that He's going to be their God. And the way that these bhakti cults function with each one with their specific God is kind of like people, this is a very probably offensive to Hindus for me to put it this way, but it's almost like people are with sports teams. Like, I like the Tennessee Titans, somebody might say. They're the best team. They might even say, they're the only real football team or something like that. And they don't mean literally that there aren't other teams, and they're fully aware that other people are fans of other teams, and that's their favorite team, and that those other people are as passionate about those other teams as the Titans are about their team. And it's just that they've got their favorite team, and that's as far as they're concerned, that's the only one that matters. And this is how peoples in the day of Abraham thought about their own gods and other gods. So they can well recognize that Yahweh is a real God who really is with Isaac, but that doesn't mean that that's their God now or something like that. All right. So he says, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we say, let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. Verse 29, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you, and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. Then he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they arose early and exchanged oaths. Then Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. Now, notice a couple of things here. When you make an oath, when you do a business deal or a treaty or any kind of serious thing like this, normally what will happen is you will have the meal, and then you will do your business. The fact that they do their business and then they have the meal kind of speaks to the level of disagreement or discomfort that exists between the two of them. This would have been highly impolite to just start talking before you've had the meal. You have the meal and then you do the talking during the meal. That's how this goes. So this would have been somewhat offensive or impolite or not very gentlemanlike on both parts. But the fact they do end up eating a meal and exchanging compliments, well, Abimelech pays compliments and all that, and they do end up leaving in peace, tells you that at least it all got settled. And the same thing that God worked out for Abraham and Abimelech, God is working out for Isaac and this Abimelech, or Abimelech, whichever way it turns out to be. Verse 32, now it came about on the same day that Isaac's servants came in and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. Now that's funny. Any good well that's a functional well would have water. So that they dug a well and found water is not really probably the most important thing to notice here. They did dig a well and find water, but that it's said right here at this moment, at this time, when we've already been talking about wells left, right, and center, that this well has been dug, and it says here, we found water, is probably a little bit of a literary device to say, like, we found water, we've found peace. It's kind of like this thing is finally worked out. I'm not saying they didn't actually find water in a well. I'm just saying that they dug this well, they found the water, and in the same way, at the same moment, they found peace, a different kind of metaphorical water. Verse 33, so he called it Sheba, therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. And he's named this well. He's named all his father's wells the same thing they were, and he's named this well the same thing it already was too, in the same location anyway. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. And that brings us to the end of this chapter, and we'll go ahead and conclude there. But I think it's important to notice that as we began with the Word Biblical Commentary and what they had to say about this, I think they're absolutely right. You can see how a man who makes his own mistakes, just like his father did, and in the case of Isaac, it really doesn't do much. As we said in the last lecture, and now again in this lecture, a man who's pretty passive. It's not that he doesn't display faith, but for the most part, even the faith he displays is done with passivity. And yet at this moment, we do see him actually doing some things. We saw him in the last lecture praying on behalf of his wife, and God honors that. But now we see absolute certainty that not only has God stated that he's going to be with Isaac and to bless Isaac, but more than that, we're seeing now that he's actually demonstrated that that's true by working out this situation for him in exactly the same way he worked it out for his father Abraham. Now we're going to try to move through chapter 27 and the first portion of chapter 28 in this lecture. So I'll go ahead and explain to you now why we're doing it that way. Even though we've already read verses 34 and 35 of Genesis chapter 26, many scholars think that this is a section that should be on its own. As we've repeatedly said now, by this point, the chapters aren't inspired, the chapter numbers and all of that. Those were added for our ease of finding things in the massive text of the Bible. And sometimes we can disagree with where they were placed. And we might imagine that the author would disagree with where they've been placed. So, for example, if you look at verse 34 of Genesis chapter 26, you'll see that it says, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, so it looks like we've started a new section. Remember, we said earlier in this lecture that throughout the majority of chapter 26, there's no mention of Jacob and Esau. I should have been more cautious in saying that. Esau is mentioned in verse 34. But this is because this probably wasn't supposed to belong to the same little discussion. Our author starts talking about something a little bit differently with verse 34, and you'll notice it's bookended rather well with chapter 28. Go over and look at chapter 28 and verse 8. It says, so Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac. And it talks about that a little bit more. So it seems that this little section of text that we're going to discuss now here at the end of this lecture seems to be bookended by the author by a discussion of Isaac and Rebekah's displeasure at Esau's wives, and then coming back around to that at the end of that discussion that is in chapter 28, verse 8. So you might just kind of ignore the fact that these are in different chapters and realize that those chapters maybe shouldn't be where they are, and that this is the section of text that seems to hang together. It seems obvious that that's the case. So we're going to look at it that way. Now notice that Esau in verse 34 is the same age when he got married that his father Isaac was when he got married. But even though Abraham took special care to make sure that Isaac was going to get a wife from back in the homeland outside of Canaan, at least the land where the family was, Isaac does not make sure necessarily that his son does the same. Now, it does say that Isaac and Rebekah were displeased at this, But it's important to notice that it looks like maybe Isaac didn't take as much special care to make sure that his sons married from within their own people instead of the land that they're living in. He took more care to make sure that was the case than Abraham, his father, had. Esau marries two Hittite women, and Hittites were a subgroup of the Canaanites. So he's very much married the people of the land. This kind of makes you feel a little bit better about Jacob and Rebekah's actions, where they try to pull off this trick on Isaac about which son he's dealing with that you probably know about already, even though we haven't studied it yet. It makes you feel a little bit better about that because perhaps Esau doesn't deserve the Abrahamic blessings, and perhaps Isaac didn't go so far as he should to make sure that his sons marry within the land. And perhaps Isaac isn't paying enough attention to the prophecy that was made about how these sons would go. And so there's some evidence here that Isaac perhaps isn't operating with as much faith and in the spirit that his father Abraham did. Now, let's go ahead and continue reading. First of all, I want you to notice, because we're going to come back to this later, that it does say that the wives of Esau brought grief on Isaac and Rebekah. This was a big source of problem within the family, source of difficulty within the family. Chapter 27 and verse 1 says, "Now it came about when Isaac was old, and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called his older son Esau, and said to him, 'My son.' And he said to him, 'Here I am.' Isaac said, 'Behold, now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, please take your gear, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die.'" Now notice here that in verse 1 it had said that his eyes were too dim to see. And this, of course, is a bit of foreshadowing to what's about to happen when, by virtue of his eyes being too dim to see, he's able to be tricked about which son he's dealing with, right? Now, it's interesting. It was common for male offspring to come before the father so that the father could pronounce blessings on them at the point of his death. But it's odd that he only seems to be interested in blessing one of them. This doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Why is it that Isaac is only going to bless Esau? Well, one thing I want you to notice is it does seem like Isaac and Rebekah had favorites among these two sons. Isaac seems to have a favorite in Esau, and Rebekah seems to have a favorite in Jacob. And we talked a little bit about that before, because back in chapter 25, it does mention that that this is the case. It says in verse 27 of chapter 25, "When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in the tents." Now, Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So you do see there that there is evidence that, or the Bible flatly tells us that they had favorites. Now, I mentioned this previously, I think, in this series, but it's hard to imagine how parents can have favorites among their children. You know, I have two daughters, and even though one of them is more obviously similar to me, both in physical appearance and maybe where her interests are, it's the idea that I would love one of them more than the other, or even like one more than the other, is seemingly unimaginable to me. Now, maybe I'm just unique in this. My parents have talked about this the same way. My brother and I are very different in a lot of respects, but they say the same sort of thing. It's like there's a strange equality in your children if you really love them, that you tend to love them the same even though they're very different. So it's hard for me to relate to this situation with Isaac and Rebekah and how they feel about their sons. But I want you to notice we see it here in this passage, not only because Isaac asks Esau to go get him a savory meal and so that he can bless him with no mention of Jacob, but I want you to notice that in verse 5, it says, "Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son." It doesn't say their son, doesn't say her son, it says his son. Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. Now, you might say, well, you're reading too much into it. Well, maybe I am. I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. If you continue on reading, it says, "So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game to bring home, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, 'Behold, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, saying,'" and then she goes on from there. So notice that it says his son when it's talking about Esau, it's talking about Isaac. Isaac spoke to his son, and then it says in verse 6, Rebekah said to her son, Rebekah. So I want you to notice here that we really do, the author seems to want to go out of his way to show you that there is definitely favoritism going on, definitely a bond between father and son with Isaac and Esau, and a bond between Jacob and Rebekah, and that bond does not necessarily exist to that extent between Isaac and Jacob or between Rebekah and Esau. So that's going to be helpful in understanding what happens throughout the rest of the story. Now, what did she hear him say? Well, behold, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, saying, verse 7, bring me some game and prepare a savory dish for me, that I may eat and bless you. Now, notice that that's not exactly what he said. It's basically what he said. But notice that in verse 4, which is what she's quoting, what Isaac had actually said was, that I may eat so that my soul may bless you before I die. So that my soul may bless you before I die. When she recounts it, she says that I may eat and bless you. So she's saying, your father said that I may eat and bless Esau. But what he actually said was that my soul might bless you. Now, you're going to see, especially when we get into the later part of this chapter, down in verse 33 and following that, Moses is trying to use, he's telling what happened, but he's using some very flowery and emotional language about what's going on. These things mean something. And some scholars seem to think that when it says, my soul may bless you, that this is like an over-the-top dramatic statement about how much he wants to bless Esau and obviously the great affection that he has. And that when Rebekah kind of tones down his words and just says, well, he said so that he could bless him, so that I may bless you, that she's kind of softening it so that Jacob goes along with the plan and doesn't recognize how serious this love and favoritism really is. Maybe that's what's happening. All right, now it says in verse 8, now therefore, my son, listen to me as I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats from there, that I may prepare them as a savory dish for your father, such as he loves. Then you shall bring it to your father, that he may eat, so that he may bless you before his death. Now, notice, she's going to do almost everything. All he has to do is to take it to the father and receive the blessing. That's it. He doesn't have to do anything else. She's going to do it all. She's going to prepare it. She's going to do it. Well, why couldn't he prepare it? Why couldn't he make the meal? Well, it just seems like Rebekah is being overly controlling here. She's going to make sure that she can handle as much of it as she possibly can so that, nothing goes wrong. She wants to handle this herself as best she can. Wants to make sure that the plan goes off without a hitch or something. And then it says in verse 11, Jacob answered his mother Rebekah, behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man. Now notice the play on words. Esau means hairy, and Jacob is saying the hairy man is a hairy man. Basically like as if obviously the hairy guy is hairy, right? It doesn't come through in translation as much, but Esau means hairy. So, behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, then I will be a deceiver in his sight, or as a deceiver in his sight. And I will bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. Now, notice here, Jacob doesn't seem to be opposed to the idea because it would be going against his father's wishes. He doesn't seem to be too concerned about the fact that he'd be going against what his brother might want. He's not protesting that. His only protest is we might get caught. That's what he's concerned about. We might get caught. I'm not hairy like hairy Esau is. Now, this gives us more indication that perhaps Jacob... Now, I know we always, when we read this, or if you're anything like me, reading this all my life, I've tended to kind of, even though I know that what happens ultimately works out, I tend to side with Isaac and Esau in this. Like, this isn't very fair. But remember, given what we've already discussed about the prophecy and how Isaac seems to be not taking that as seriously as he should be, about the older serving the younger, and it seems like his favorite is Esau just for other reasons, perhaps just Esau's manliness and just the natural connection that they have there. It seems like that perhaps Jacob and Rebekah are maybe more in the right than we might normally have thought, and maybe Jacob recognizes this. Now, Jacob has proven himself to be so far a pretty secular man. It's not, and in fact, it isn't. He doesn't make Yahweh his own God. They're the gods of his fathers until later on in the story. He's operated somewhat deceptively in at least one other case so far. So we're not trying to say he was so holy, but it does seem to be the case that at least Rebekah and maybe Jacob too are recognizing something is going on here that is not right. And they have a desire to take action. Now, whether the action they took was the right way to handle things isn't really the point. The point is that I don't know if we can be as hard on them as we normally would be when we see what's going on with Isaac and Esau. Maybe everybody's at fault. Who knows? But we do notice here that Jacob isn't protesting this operation. He's only protesting how the execution is going to go. He's afraid that he's going to be discovered. Right? And then, so his mother says, but his mother said to him, your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother. Now, she says, don't worry about it. The curse will be on my head. As if to say, if Isaac pronounces a curse, because if you're found out and instead of a blessing, you actually get a curse, don't worry. We're gonna intercede and make sure that curse comes on me. Now, that's an interesting idea, isn't it? It sounds like what we often do in daily life, where we just say, don't worry about that. I'll take the blame for it. But she's saying something a little bit stronger. If there's a curse involved, I'll make sure that this curse falls on my head. Now, it's not entirely sure that she could have ensured such a thing. I mean, it's not clear to me that she could guarantee that some curse that would be pronounced would necessarily fall to her. Is that it? I mean, what's she got to do with that? How's that her business? How can she ensure that Isaac would do that or that God would permit that? Also, the flip side of that seems a little bit strange. Could she take a blessing on Jacob's behalf? Would that even be possible? If she could take a curse, could she intercede and get the blessing instead? Well, we wouldn't suspect that would be the case. So why would we suspect that she could get a curse in his stead? It's a strange verse. Really, what it probably just speaks to is the fact that she's trying to bypass the concern and assuage his fears because she's confident this is going to be pulled off, or she's kind of just going all in. She feels like she doesn't have another option, so we're just going all in here, and this is just her way of appeasing Jacob, but really, this is the only play we've got. Verse 14 in the second half says, and his mother made savory food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her elder son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And she put the skins of the young goats on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. She also gave the savory food and the bread which she had made to her son Jacob. Then he came to his father and said, my father. And he said, here, actually, before we go on to verse 18, let's talk about this. Some people have been skeptical of this because putting goat skin on his arms would seem to be too hairy, right? I mean, have you ever touched a hairy man's arm that was as hairy as goat skin? Some people say, well, this is obviously some kind of mythological, legendary sort of thing because nobody's skin is that hairy. Well, first of all, it's not actually technically true that nobody's skin is that hairy. There is a guy living today that shows up on a lot of Discovery Channel shows, or anytime a show highlights people with strange genetic disorders, with abnormal sort of things. They'll always show this one guy who's completely hairy, like all over his body. He is so hairy, it's like animal fur all over his body. It's a very strange thing. You say, well, that can't be what Esau was like. Well, I'm not 100% sure what Esau was like, but I can tell you this. If you'll go back again to chapter 25, and if you'll look at verse 25 of chapter 25, you'll see that it says about Esau, the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment. Now, we're talking about a baby. We're talking about an infant. We think it's kind of impressive when a baby is born today with a full head of hair, like on his head, like a lot of hair. But the Bible says in verse 25 of chapter 25 that he was like a hairy garment all over. Now, to be like a hairy garment all over, this was an unusual kid. He was unusually hairy. I mean, there were certainly, I'm sure, a lot of people born, somewhat hairy. Kids today, you might get a particularly hairy kid. Again, by which we mean he's got a lot of hair on his head, even at the point of birth. My oldest daughter, or my youngest daughter, was born with a lot of black hair when she was born on her head. Now she turns out now she's blonde, but she was born with a full head of dark black hair. It's very interesting. But that can happen. But you don't name a kid Harry because of that. That they named him Harry, and that the Bible says he was like a hairy garment all over, kind of indicates to you that it was noteworthy enough that we named this kid this, right? So perhaps he was hairy enough that goat skin would have tricked anyone. May have anybody touched it with their eyes closed might have been tricked because he was that hairy. Even though that seems strange, it's possible. There are people like that, even if it's a rarity. But beyond that, we also have to consider the fact that Isaac is old now, and we're going to find out his sense of smell, his sense of sight, and it seems like he has decent hearing, but it seems like most of his sensory perceptions are muted now that he's that old in age. All right, he's that old. All right, let's continue and take a look in verse 18. Then he came to his father and said, "My father," and he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father. Now I want you to notice as we go through this how wordy Jacob is at first, how much Jacob is talking at first. I don't think many people notice this, but he stops that once there's some suspicion about who he is by the sound of his voice. "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his, and he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Get up, please, sit and eat my game, that you may bless me." Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have it so quickly, my son?" And he said, "Because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me." Now again, notice the Lord your God. Remember I said a moment ago, Jacob is still somewhat a secular man at this point. Well, he's referring to Isaac's God as Isaac's God, the Lord your God. But also notice that this is a lousy cover. We can see Jacob maybe getting a little bit nervous at this point, if we can imagine this in our mind's eye. How'd you get this so quickly? You just left a moment ago. How did you get this game so quick? Your God did this. It's kind of like a God of the gaps sort of thing. It's hard to believe. God did it. God caused it to happen to me. Verse 21, then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come close that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." Well, why would he be skeptical? Well, we're about to find out. So Jacob came close to Isaac, his father, and he felt him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. So the thing was, he didn't find him out ultimately, but he is skeptical because he hears the voice, and Jacob's been talking a lot, using way more words than probably necessarily has to use. And it seems obvious to Isaac that's the voice of Jacob. So at that point, you'll notice, and I don't think a lot of people notice this, but notice Jacob doesn't say another word after this, except for shortly in verse 24, where he says, where Isaac asks, "Are you really my son?" And he said, "I am." That's all he said. All he wants to say going forward is, "I am." He just wants to quickly answer because he doesn't want, he realizes, I've probably run my mouth too much. I'm going to give this whole operation away. I better just be as quiet as I can. So he was suspicious, but it ultimately goes through. So, verse 25, he said, "Bring it to me, and I will eat of my son's game, that I may bless you." And he brought it to him, and he ate. He also brought him wine, and he drank. Now, this is important. He brought him wine. It may just be that he brought him wine just because, but it seems like he's bringing him wine to make sure that his senses are further dulled. Let's kind of seal the deal. Give him a little bit, give him a little bit of wine so that he's not, he's a little bit relaxed, and he's not maybe going to be quite so concerned with these sorts of things. Verse 26, then his father Isaac said to him, "Please come close and kiss me, my son." So he came close and kissed him. Now notice, this is right after the wine. This is probably, if you're trying to make this thing work, that was probably a good idea. And when he smelled the smell of his garments, he blessed him and said, "See the smell of my son. is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Now may God give you of the dew of heaven, and of the fatness of the earth, and an abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you, and nations bow down to you. And this is all the kind of thing that sounds similar in some respect. It's not exactly like, though, the Abrahamic blessing that we've become familiar with. But there are some hints of it here or there. But we're going to see a more robust Abrahamic type blessing later on in the chapter, or at least later on in this story. But I do want you to notice here that so far it sounds somewhat like it, a little bit like it. But then we get down to the second half of verse 29. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. This sounds a bit like, it's a little bit obvious that he thinks he's talking to Isaac, or blessing Isaac. that he's blessing Esau here. It's because he wants his mother's sons. Remember, his son, Esau, her son, Jacob, and now he's saying, nations bow down to you, and be the master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. All right. Now it came about as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob. We can almost hear Jacob breathing a sigh of relief. And Jacob had hardly gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. Then he also made savory food and brought it to his father. See, he's completely unaware of all this, Esau that is. And he said to his father, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. Isaac his father said to him, who are you? And he said, I am your son, your firstborn Esau. Then Isaac trembled violently and said, now notice it says he trembled violently. Think about how upset this made him, how shocked he was that he trembled violently, and said, who was he then that hunted game and brought it to me, so that I ate of all of it before you came and blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. So now notice, even though this was a trick, it's almost like this is irreversible. I mean, it is. He's saying, look, I was tricked. I don't know who this was that came, but that person's going to be blessed. There's no undoing this. The blessing is done. When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. And notice this. Isaac trembled violently, and now Esau lets out this cry. I mean, the author, Moses, really wants to be emphatic here. He really wants you to get how serious this is, how much is at stake, and maybe how much Jacob almost missed out on, that we might have had, or Jacob might have had this sort of a reaction, or Rebekah, if it had gone the other way and the trick had not worked, that they would be trembling and upset and crying that this thing has happened and gone south, right? Let's see. He cried out in a great bitter cry and said to his father, bless me, even me also, O my father. And he said, your brother came deceitfully, and has taken away your blessing. Then he said, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. Remember we said that Jacob means grabber, or the one who grabs the heel, or supplanter, or, yeah, it's kind of like deceiver. Deceiver is not a far stretch from what's going on here. It's a supplanter. And he's now done this, right? That's why Esau says that he's rightly named Jacob, for he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken away my blessing. And he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? But Isaac replied to Esau, behold, I have made him your master, and all his relatives I have given to him as servants, and with grain and new wine I have sustained him. Now as for you then, what can I do, my son? Esau said to his father, so he's pushing further, do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. Now, Esau's about to give a little bit of a blessing. It's a much less extravagant blessing. But Isaac's point is, the nature of the blessing that I've already pronounced is so great that whatever I have left to bless you with, it's going to pale in comparison. You're not getting the better end of this. But he does go ahead. So Esau lifted his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, and here's a little bit of a blessing, behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about, when you become restless, that you will break his yoke from your neck. Because there's a little bit of hope here at the end of this very sad sort of negative blessing. There is a little bit of hope that you will break his yoke from your neck. Now, what could that possibly be referring to? Well, Gordon Wenham says it like this. From the time of David, Edom, which is the nation that's going to come out of Esau, was part of the Israelite empire, but later it regained its independence, and after the fall of Jerusalem took revenge on Judah. It is perhaps these events to which, when you grow restless, you shall tear off his yoke. It's a different translation. That's what that refers to. Thus, the blessing of Esau does end with a glimmer of hope. So it kind of does turn out, at least we have something that probably satisfies this blessing that we can refer to later on in the history. All right, verse 41. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, now notice it says that he says this to himself. That's going to be important in a minute. The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Okay, so he's going to kill his brother. This reminds us of Cain and Abel, right? I will kill my brother. Now, when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now, how did she know about this? It says that what Esau had said was reported to him, but it also had previously said Esau just said this to himself. So either there were some servants around that heard him say this and reported it, or maybe he had been bragging about it. Maybe he did initially say it to himself, but then he kind of started bragging about it and word got back to her. But whatever the case may be, she did find out about this and lets Jacob in on the plan. Now, therefore, my son, obey my voice. Now, I meant to say something about this earlier, but she had previously said to Jacob in verse 13 of the chapter, but his mother said to him, your curse be on me, my son. Now only obey my voice and go get them for me. The language here, in the original language, the phrasing here is very commanding. In fact, it's somewhat unique in the Old Testament from what I understand. Again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but my understanding is it's somewhat unique in the Old Testament to have a female character being that commanding with her language. She's giving him an order, almost like a military order. She said, do what I tell you. And she did that back there in verse 13. And now she's doing it again in verse 43. Now, therefore, my son, obey my voice and arise, flee to Haran, to my brother Laban. Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides. Now, she's thinking that this is only going to last a little while and then she can call him back. But what she's not understanding is that some other things are going to happen. Now, ultimately, Esau's fury will subside, but that could have taken years from what we know. But what you'll see, but we know what happens when he goes to Laban. He ends up finding Rachel there, but ends up getting Leah too, as we know the story goes. So he ends up staying gone much longer. But she thinks it's only going to be a few days. And then verse 45 says, until your brother's anger against you subsides and he forgets what you did to him. Then I will send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day? Now, the next part moves away from that dialogue. So I want to say she's hedged her bets somewhat wrongly. I mean, it worked out well, according to her plan, at least insofar as the blessing went. But her fear is, okay, if you stay here, then he's going to kill you. And then he's probably going to be sent away or something like that, or killed himself, or who knows. And I'm going to lose both my sons at once. But if you go away, then he'll get over it and you can come back. But as it ends up, she did, in a certain respect, end up losing at least Jacob, and we'll find out more as we go along. So look down at verse 46. Rebekah said to Isaac, I am tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth like these, from the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? Okay, so now, even though she commands him to go, clearly this is a later conversation with Isaac. And it's apparently they've already, had their discussions about what had happened. That we're not told about that. We're not told about the section where Isaac must have said, "What in the world, woman, were you thinking? Did you have something to do with this?" We don't learn anything about that. So this is apparently sometime later, and Jacob is not left because she's trying to say, if he does what his brother does and marries one of these Hittite women, I can't handle it. This is how bad these Hittite women were to the family. I don't know if they were just terrible women, or she can't handle that they married. She knows that this violated what perhaps God really wanted with their family not marrying with the Canaanites, and she's aware of this, and so she's bothered that he's done this, and it may be that alone, they may have been wonderful people, but that alone has made it awful and difficult. Or it could be that they were just particularly bad people, or both. But either way, she's saying, if Jacob does this, I'm not going to be able to handle this. I can't live anymore. I'm tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. Right? But the point is, Jacob hasn't left yet. So he didn't listen to his mother this time. He did last time. I don't know if he thinks that didn't go well, and now my brother's out to kill me or what, but he's not listening to her anymore, at least not like he was. It's going to take Isaac telling him for him to go. So, chapter 28, verse 1 says, "So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, 'You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take to yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you.'" Now he's hearing it from Isaac now. Apparently Isaac's learned to live with this situation. Maybe by now he's learned his lesson about paying more attention to what God wants. And now he does give something that looks a bit more on the nail, or on the head. He's hitting the nail on the head about the Abrahamic blessing. He says, "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of people. May he also give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your descendants with you. And you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." Okay, so that's pretty good blessing. That's more in line with what we've come to expect of the Abrahamic blessing. "Then Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Paddan Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob, and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take to himself a wife from there. And that when he blessed him, he charged him, saying, 'You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan.' And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother, and had gone to Paddan Aram. So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac. And Esau went to Ishmael and married." Now, when it says he went to... Now, there's a couple things here. Well, let me go ahead and finish the verse. He went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahaleth, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. Now, number one, I want you to notice that Esau doesn't seem to be that smart of a guy. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to be accurate. It doesn't seem like Esau is that smart if it's taken him this long, probably knowing the family history and knowing that, what had happened with his mother, that Isaac had been, that Abraham had sent a servant to go get Rebekah for Isaac from among the people outside of Canaan. And he should have picked up on it just from knowing that story, that it's not the best thing to marry the Hittites. But he also should have figured this out already just from, seeing how upset his parents were about these Hittite wives of his, that his mother can't even hardly live with these women. Yet it says in verse 8 of chapter 28, "So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac." Yeah, you think? This should have been made clear already. So that's number one. He may not be that smart of a guy. But number two, when it says in verse 9, "And Esau went to Ishmael and married," it's likely that Ishmael's already dead. When it says he went to Ishmael, it just probably means the family of Ishmael. And so now he's decided that he's going to try to marry within the family. But it's not going to help in terms of the ongoing promise through the child of the Spirit, through Isaac, and then now through Jacob, because Ishmael is not in that line either, and now it's too little too late anyway. So this is where we're going to leave it off now. We have moved quite a bit through this story, and now we see Jacob is on his way, and we're going to see what happens with Jacob on his trip in our next lecture. I hope this has been a blessing to you.